Welcome to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series, brought to you by Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. My name is Steve Damaris, and I'm the Taylor Chair in Applied Big Game Research and Instruction at Mississippi State University. Thanks for joining me. This photograph shows a really nice-looking pine plantation from the air. The goal of a planted pine plantation is to produce timber. And as that pine plantation is being planted, there are certain silvicultural goals of the site preparation process. Think of it as a farmer going out to plant soybeans or corn. They're going to prepare the soil and potentially treat with some type of an herbicide or soil treatment along the way to decrease the vegetative competition with their crop. They don't want a lot of weeds in their soybean fields or their corn fields, so they're going to try to decrease vegetative competition. They're also going to try to optimize the time till canopy closure. A commercially produced pine stand to get the canopy closed as quickly as possible so that you can move on to the next stage, because that's all about producing timber. And then there's a rotation length is usually optimized. Now I'm using optimized instead of maximized in this case, because if you grow the trees too fast, you can actually have lower quality wood characteristics that are not desirable for lumber. So producers of lumber want trees that have grown correctly in the right amount of time so that their wood characteristics are optimized. And so you can decrease the vegetative competition, and you don't want to push the canopy closure too quickly and make the rotation too short, because then the wood would not be optimum characteristics for lumber. Timber companies worked a lot during the 1900s to improve their production of pine trees. They had genetically improved trees, and they would work to reduce that competition during the initial planting. And this intensity of site prep really peaked in the late 1990s, such that the timber companies were very effective at reducing that competition. They used a series of herbicide treatments and genetically improved crop trees, and they were able to grow trees so quickly that they actually started slowing back on just how intensively they grew their trees. So now that's why I was saying in the previous slide, they try to optimize that growth rate. But this concern for intensive management during the 1990s and early 2000s, concern of the general public looking at these forested lands, and particularly the hunting public that was leasing these lands from the private industrial landowner companies, looked at these stands and said, it's a biological desert. There's no deer food, there's no food for other wildlife or cover for wildlife. And so this concern for the really intensive site preparation methods used in the 1990s led to some MSU Deer Lab research to address this concern over the biological desert perspective from the general public and from the hunting public. The goal of this research was to determine how do the wildlife resources respond to these changes in management intensity. And so we worked with timber industry representatives to identify pine plantation management regimes, in other words, approaches to site preparation. We wanted to look at a range of operational intensities that were designed to produce a gradient in vegetation management intensity, resulting in a gradient in potential pine growth and also a gradient in wildlife habitat responses. We wanted to look at very low intensity up through moderate intensity and also very high intensity, and learn how those levels of intensity or those management regimes, those management decisions might affect habitat quality for wildlife. This was a very large-scale project. We had 4 large timber stands down in the lower coastal plain soil region. Within each of the stands, we had 5 treatments. Those treatments here labeled in the pink area, that's a timber stand. It was anywhere from 80 to 100 acres in size, and we wanted stands where we could break them into 5 pieces of roughly 20 acres apiece and assign 5 different treatments. And those treatments were assigned randomly within the stand, and then we sampled over a period of 8 years to understand how these different management regimes were going to affect pine production and wildlife habitat quality and wildlife population numbers. Before I describe the management regimes in detail, I want to show some examples for those that aren't forestry oriented. This is what's referred to as a combination plow and V-blade. It's a bulldozer, and on the front of it is a V-shaped blade that pushes the debris away from in front of the bulldozer. Because as you can see, there's a lot of debris left during a harvesting operation. So that pushes the debris away from the bulldozer, and then behind that combo plow discs the soil like a farmer would. It's subsoil, so it has a prong that reaches down into the soil and basically like a knife slices through it, and it also beds the soil like a farmer would want to bed for a crop. So that plow behind the bulldozer is preparing the soil bed for planting. Competition control typically involves some type of herbicide application. And this application can be done in 2 ways. One is referred to as a broadcast application, in this case by a helicopter, and that is the most cost-effective approach because you can treat large areas very quickly. Another approach is called banded application, where typically a crew of workers physically carries some type of a spray rig on their back and walks through an area and sprays a band of herbicide over a smaller area that typically is centered around the row of pine trees that are planted. Let's take a look at the different treatments or management regimes that were used in this study. We wanted those bookends, the very low herbicide intensity treatment versus the very high herbicide intensity treatment. The first level, that lowest level, is a mechanical site prep with that plow and V-blade and a banded herbaceous control. So you want to control the competition, but in the banded case, it is only controlled within a few feet of the row of planted pines. The second least intensive is a chemical site prep that is broadcast and banded after the trees are planted. The third treatment level, mechanical site prep that prepares the soil bed for planting, the chemical site prep, which is a broadcast site prep, and then followed by the banded herbaceous control after the trees are planted. Treatment 4 is getting more intensive because instead of the banded herbaceous control, it is a broadcast herbaceous control. So number 4 is similar to number 3 in the mechanical and chemical site prep, but the herbaceous control, controlling the herbaceous vegetation that's competing with the pine trees, it's done with a broadcast application. And then the highest intensity is treatment 5, where it's the mechanical and chemical site prep, and then the broadcast herbaceous control for not just the first year, but for the year 1 and year 2. So that was the other bookend, the most intensive treatment used. These photographs show some of the very short term, in fact, the first growing season after planting of the pine trees, and how they differ in terms of their competing vegetation. You can see the pine trees planted most easily in the intensive combination photo at the bottom. You can see the rows of pine trees, and it's easy to see them because there's very little other vegetation. In this case, there's almost no competing vegetation. You can see the beds where the soil has been brought up into a bed and then the pine trees planted along that bed. The moderate combination treatment number 3, you can see the bedded plants, but you can also see some vegetation in between the rows of pine trees. And then at the top, that top photo is the mechanical and banded herbaceous. So there was no broadcast herbicide site prep. And so in between the rows of pine trees, you see a lot of small shrubby vegetation growing. And these are the woody shrubs that were not killed by the broadcast herbicide application. So quite a lot of variation in the vegetation characteristics across these treatment regimes. The recovery of these vegetative systems is pretty quick after the herbicide treatments. This is the second growing season. I wanted to show you more of a deer eye view. This is the mechanical site prep only, so no chemical broadcast site prep, just mechanical, and then the banded herbaceous. And in this case, the shrubs are recovering quite dramatically. You can see on the right-hand side and in the middle there, quite a lot of woody vegetation, shrubs and trees growing in competition with the pine trees that you can see growing to the left side of the photograph. Here's a second growing season in the chemical only site prep treatment with a banded herbaceous treatment in year 1. This is again the second growing season. Here you do not see the woody shrubs and trees present in the previous photo because this chemical broadcast site prep killed those trees and shrubs. And so mostly what you see here is a herbaceous response during the second growing season. There's very little woody vegetation growing in this treatment other than the pine trees. This photograph during the second growing season of the moderate intensity treatment, which involved the mechanical preparation of the seed bed and a chemical site prep broadcast and a single banded herbaceous control. You see two things really important in this photograph. One is how much larger the trees are in the rows of planted pines in this treatment compared to the chemical only site prep. These trees respond very well to that mechanical preparation of the seed bed. And so that's a really good thing if you're trying to grow trees, is to prepare the soil for the planting of the trees. And then because there wasn't a broadcast herbaceous control, we see quite a bit of herbaceous response in between the rows of the pine trees. This did have a site prep broadcast initially, so it killed back the woody trees, but we have a lot of herbaceous response in between the rows of pine trees in this second growing season view of the moderate treatment. This photograph shows treatment 4, which is a much more herbicide intensive treatment because in addition to the mechanical and chemical site prep, it had a broadcast herbaceous control during year 1. And you see between the rows of pine trees, there's not much herbaceous vegetation growing. There's just a few sprigs of plants that really are not of any great value to the deer in this particular case. This photograph shows treatment 5, which was the most intensive. It had the mechanical and chemical site prep broadcast, and then also 2 years of herbaceous broadcast treatments to really control competing vegetation out there except for the pine trees. The pine trees are not sensitive to the herbicides used because of their particular chemistry. So this is the other end, the upper end of intensity, and you see that there's not a lot of vegetation between the rows of pine trees, and the pine trees are growing very well in response to that lack of competition. One of the primary goals of site preparation is to produce circumstances that allow or facilitate the growth of the pine trees. And we expected a range of variation in the growth rates, and This graph, this figure shows very dramatically that the most intensive treatments, the 4 and 5, which had the most herbicide application to control competing vegetation, had trees after 3 growing seasons had the greatest tree diameter, and that's an indication of growth rate. Diameter at breast height is the terminology. Treatment 3, the moderate level treatment, had not as much growth as the 2 more extreme treatments, the more intensive herbicide treatments, but it did exceed in 2004, which was the 3rd full growing season, it did exceed the productivity of the pine trees growing under treatments 1 and 2. So the more herbicide application you put to reduce or more of the vegetation, the greater the pine tree growth rate. And that's why most agricultural fields that you see being farmed commercially don't have weeds in them, because the weeds compete with the agricultural product. And in this case, the product is the pine tree. More herbicide, less competing vegetation, better growth rate of the pine trees. But again, the intensive herbicide treatments peaked in the 1990s, the late 1990s. We were doing this study in the early 2000s, not because that level of herbicide application was being used anymore, but we used it in this treatment to compare it as a bookend to the more moderate levels. We wanted to see on the hot end from herbicide treatment all the way down to very minimum herbicide treatment. And we see that we did affect pine tree growth rates. This figure shows the 5 treatments, and the variable on the left axis, the vertical axis, is total plant species richness. So larger values, say 65, that means there were 65 different species of plant present on the stand in that particular treatment. So treatment 1, which was the mechanical only site prep with the banded herbicide, the least amount of herbicide application, had the most species during year 1, and then there was progressively fewer species of plants going down into treatments 4 and 5, which were the broadcast herbicide treatments. You can see that those broadcast herbicide treatments were very effective at reducing the species richness, or the number of plants growing beside or in addition to the pine trees. From a wildlife habitat standpoint, we generally say we want a lot of species richness because it will support more wildlife species if you have more plant species. Year 2, you see treatment 4 increase dramatically, and that's that quick recovery of the vegetation. The herbicide treatment from year 1 was pretty significant and kept the forages from growing during year 1, but year 2, it responded quickly, and the species richness jumped up to basically the same as the other 3 treatments. Year 2, the treatment 5, remained low because it had that second year of broadcast treatment. So after year 2, the treatments 1 through 4 were pretty darn equivalent in terms of species richness. Treatment 5, the one that received 2 years of broadcast herbaceous weed control, remained low and throughout the 5 years of this particular representative data. So this shows more herbicide, fewer plant species, but once the herbicide applications stop, you have a quick response and production of a variety of plant species. We can summarize this graph to say that the 3 treatments that received banded herbicide and lesser amounts of total herbicide had more species richness than the 2 treatments that received broadcast herbicide during that first year. But again, that response of the vegetation was pretty rapid once you got past that first year, except in the most intensive treatment. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This represents a management regime that was very intensive to control competing plants. This was that treatment 5. after 2 years of growth. You see some really tall pine trees, more productive pine trees, but no food for deer and very little food and cover for other wildlife species. This is a potential problem for a wildlife biologist. This photograph shows, with a moderate use of herbicides, the site preparation herbicide treatment killed the woody vegetation, but it allowed an abundance of herbaceous forages, high quality forbs, to grow in between the pine trees because the treatment was only applied during the herbaceous weed control was applied only in a banded fashion over the pine trees. So we have a lot of food in between the rows of pine trees present after the initial site prep is completed. I like to look at this deer nutritional carrying capacity estimate because it shows us or gives us an idea of how many deer can be maintained on an acre of land for a year. And higher numbers are better. So in this particular case, you see from years 1 through 5 a lot of variation depending upon the particular treatment that was applied. But you see a lot of variation, and I don't want to get into all the nuances of the annual variation among the treatments at this point. What I do want to talk about is a general pattern of declining nutritional carrying capacity for deer, starting from relatively higher levels in year 1. By year 5, there's essentially no deer forage left on these stands, and so the nutritional carrying capacity is essentially gone after 5 years. It varies with the particular treatment on a given year, but generally it is low for all of the treatments because this was the lower coastal plain, which tends to have low quality soils and is not really highly productive for deer in this particular set of circumstances. I want to emphasize here some long-term patterns. That annual variation was pretty extreme among the treatments, and it's hard to come up with a general statement. But looking at the 5-year average site prep effects on protein-based nutritional carrying capacity, we can see some pretty good patterns. The mechanical-only treatment with limited herbicides was not, surprisingly to me, and that's why we do research, because we think we know some answers, but oftentimes they're not the answers that we end up with. In this mechanical only with very limited herbicide application, there were only 8 deer days of nutritional carrying capacity per acre. In the mechanical treatment and moderate amounts of herbicides, there are actually 20 deer days per acre, averaged over the 5 years. And then the mechanical and heavy application of herbicides, it dropped down to about 12 deer days per acre. So herbicide actually has an important role in site preparation as well as optimizing deer nutritional carrying capacity. A moderate amount of herbicide application can help improve the nutritional carrying capacity in this particular soil region, which is the lower coastal plain. And the lower coastal plain has this problem. The predominant woody vegetation in the lower coastal plain are waxy-leaved, very low-quality shrubs that predominate in the understory. And they provide very limited summertime nutrition. They do not provide the quality of protein, the level of protein that is needed to support late-stage gestation, late-stage antler development and hardening, and lactation on the part of adult females. So the lower coastal plain soil region in a typical managed pine plantation is not going to provide a lot of deer nutritional carrying capacity unless you get rid of those waxy-leaved, low-quality shrubs. The moderate herbicide application to control those low-quality shrubs helped. It helped reduce the competition for high-quality forages, such as forbs, and also from the pine trees. So removing those low-quality shrubs in the lower coastal plain helped produce high-quality forbs for our deer to eat, and also allowed the pine trees to grow. Not necessarily the quickest, but it optimized the growth of both forbs and pine trees. And again, the overall picture of the lower coastal plain under the circumstances of this study, none of the treatments maximize nutritional carrying capacity for deer. So if you're growing intensively managed pine plantations in the lower coastal plain, there's not going to be great nutritional carrying capacity available for deer. And if you remember back to the slide where we showed that antler size of 2-year-old bucks is less on properties with more intensively managed pine plantations, this is why. It just doesn't maximize forage production for deer, but it does maximize the use of the land from an economic standpoint. The best use of the lower coastal plain is for pine production. Now we have to better understand how we can optimize to benefit pine production and also deer. And from this series of treatments, we learned that a moderate herbicide application is not a bad thing for deer.